If you think Skid Row just happened in Los Angeles, like some natural outcome of poverty or bad luck, think again. Skid Row wasn't some accident of urban decay. It was built this way on purpose. The streets, the boundaries, even the services, or lack of them, were all part of a strategy, a quiet, systematic plan that most people never hear about because it's way more convenient to blame homelessness on individuals than to admit the system made it this way. People see the tents, the trash, the suffering, and they assume it's just a side effect of people making bad choices. But once you start looking into the history, it's clear. This wasn't neglect, it was design. And the further you dig, the darker it gets. Let's go back to the late 1800s, when Los Angeles was still in that rough, growing up phase. It was a boom town, filled with railroads, industry, and transient workers, mostly men who drifted in for jobs and drifted out when they were done. These men needed somewhere cheap to sleep, so naturally, the city's east side became filled with flophouses, single-room occupancies, and bars. That area eventually turned into what would be known as Skid Row. But even then, the city wasn't just letting this happen, it was pushing it. Zoning laws and building permits quietly ensured this pocket of LA stayed filled with low-income housing and temporary lodging. City officials knew exactly what they were doing. They created a zone where society's most undesirable populations could be concentrated, away from the booming downtown business district. By the early 1900s, LA was already getting embarrassed about its growing homeless population, especially as it tried to build this image of glamour and prosperity. So what did city leaders do? They didn't solve the problem, they quarantined it. They drew invisible boundaries around Skid Row and poured in shelters, missions, and services, but only within that small area. That move wasn't compassionate, it was containment. The city wasn't trying to help these people, it was trying to keep them out of sight. It was like LA decided, okay, you can exist, but only right here. They weren't addressing the root causes of homelessness. They were just sweeping it under one big, very specific rug. And this wasn't just a moral failure, it was a policy. City leaders coordinated with police, property developers, and even charity organizations to push homeless people into Skid Row and keep them there. LAPD literally had unofficial orders to shuttle unhoused people from other neighborhoods right back into Skid Row. They called it dumping. People were picked up from wealthier areas and dropped off in Skid Row like garbage. This wasn't isolated, it was routine. The city created a boundary, and if you were poor, addicted, mentally ill, or just down on your luck, you were only allowed to exist inside that boundary. The 1970s is when things went from bad to brutal. That's when LA started closing its mental health hospitals under what was called deinstitutionalization. Thousands of patients were released with nowhere to go. You can probably guess where most of them ended up: Skid Row. It was the only place with any kind of services, no matter how limited. But what people don't talk about enough is that this wasn't just a medical decision, it was a budget one. California slashed funding to mental health care, and patients who needed long-term care were suddenly out on the streets. There was no safety net, and because Skid Row already had shelters and missions, even if they were overrun and underfunded, it became the dumping ground for people with nowhere else to turn. Fast forward to the 1980s, when the crack epidemic hit LA. While the rest of the country was worried about suburban crime, Skid Row turned into a war zone overnight. Drugs flooded the streets, but the city still refused to treat this like a public health issue. Instead, they doubled down on the containment model. More patrols, more jail time, but still only in this one section of downtown. Cops weren't cleaning up the problem. They were making sure it stayed within the lines. If you were using or selling drugs outside of Skid Row, you got arrested. If you did it in Skid Row, you were mostly left alone. That's how controlled this system was. By the 2000s, downtown LA started gentrifying. High-end lofts, trendy restaurants, art galleries, you name it. But right next door, Skid Row. You'd think this would spark some pressure to fix the area, right? Nope. In fact, it had the opposite effect. City leaders clung to Skid Row as a way to separate undesirable populations from the shiny new developments. Developers even argued in favor of keeping Skid Row as is, because it acted like a human moat, separating their luxury projects from the realities of poverty. And it worked. Real estate prices soared on one side of the line, while the other side stayed in chaos. It was segregation by economics, enforced not with fences, but with policy and police. And let's talk about housing. Every major city has a housing crisis, but LA's is extra severe because for decades it basically refused to build affordable housing outside of Skid Row. Landlords and city officials worked together to block low-income projects in wealthier neighborhoods. Meanwhile, what little affordable housing existed in other parts of the city slowly disappeared thanks to gentrification, Airbnb, and eviction-friendly laws. So guess what happened? Thousands more people ended up in Skid Row, not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. Skid Row became the final destination for everyone priced out of the rest of the city. Even charity became part of the trap. See, a lot of the non-profit and government funding for homeless services was restricted to Skid Row itself. So if you were homeless in Venice or Hollywood or West LA, you were told to go downtown. It created this feedback loop where the only place you could legally or practically get help was also the least livable part of the city. That's not help. That's crowd control. And it meant the people who needed the most assistance were corralled into a tiny area with minimal resources, constant surveillance, and no way out. And you've probably heard that LA spends hundreds of millions on homelessness, right? But here's the ugly truth. Most of that money doesn't go towards solving the problem. A huge chunk goes to police overtime, sanitation sweeps, and security contracts. And most of the shelters in Skid Row are so overrun, underfunded, and mismanaged that people would rather sleep on the sidewalk. The city isn't building exits, it's building fences. Bureaucratic delays, corruption, and bad faith decision-making mean the money goes everywhere except where it's actually needed. Skid Row isn't just the result of poverty, it's the result of decades of planning. Every major institution in LA, housing, law enforcement, healthcare, politics, they all played a part in engineering this neighborhood to contain, isolate, and punish people who didn't fit into the city's glossy image of success. The cruelty wasn't random, it was designed. It's easier to manage poverty when it's confined to one zip code, easier to pretend things are fine when suffering is hidden behind a wall of indifference. And the wildest part? Skid Row is just 50 blocks. That's it. 50 blocks in one of the richest cities on the planet, filled with people who've been pushed, forgotten, and locked into a system that was built to fail them. But the lie we're told is that these people are broken, that Skid Row is the price of freedom or growth. In reality, it's the price of neglect. It's the result of decades of decisions made to protect profit, not people. So next time someone says they should just fix Skid Row, remember, it was never meant to be fixed. It was built to be broken. The only way to truly change it is to stop pretending it was ever accidental, because once you realize it was engineered, then you know it can be unbuilt too. But that requires something LA has never been great at, owning up to the past and actually choosing compassion over control. Until then, Skid Row will keep existing exactly the way it was designed to.